Hi everyone. Good day. Good morning. Welcome back to American Church History. And this is week number 4. We're trying to discuss American Church History. This is a part 1 of our class. So we were last week we did try to define history, what it is, and why do we do the history. So here's a Merriam-Webster, the dictionary definition, and then we did look at Oxford Dictionary as well, one of the authorities in the English dictionary. And then some scholars' definition. And let's see. So we were talking about E.H. Carl. As he says, it's a dialogue between the past and the present. And by doing this dialogue, the history aims to bring an understanding or wisdom. The wisdom would be the key word for doing history. So wise people, wise person, one with the wisdom, he or she is able to bring the learning or lessons from his or her own past. The same principle applies to doing any kind of history of a nation, history of a church. Or the other way around, if you're able to do a good history, you can bring that same principle of doing history or the reason for doing history to your own personal life. So you can go back and see and learn and bring that to today and make your life better. So what is a better life? It's open to the discussion, but at least whether you're Christian or non-Christian, whether you're communist, socialist, or a capitalist, whatever your belief is, doing history benefits you by providing the wisdom everyone, whether you're young or old, whether you're black or white or Asian, in the past or even today or future, everyone lives within reality. Reality is where we are. It's a time and space. And the reality is real. If such a thing as ideality, is very contrast to the reality. Ideal is what you dream about. It is It is good and perfect. It depends on your belief, what is good and what is perfect. But still, it is generally, universally good and perfect and happy. Let's say happy. How you define happiness, happy, will be different from one to another. But still, you have all your own, concept and understanding and definition of being happy. So that's ideal. But the reality is not so perfect. It's not so happy. It's not so good. That's who we are, where we are. That's human reality. And any person with a normal, common, average personality and identity, he or she wants to go from real to ideal. You want to be happy, you want to be good, and you want to be perfect. But we know we are not. But that does not mean that you give up on being happy. The life is all about being happy, happiness. In spite of reality, you're poor, you have to always work, so thus you are fatigued, and you want to enjoy the time, but you're not able to because you have to work. You still need to learn and get the degree, and you don't have like permanent visa to stay in America, even if you want to stay here. See, these things, that's reality. But to bring reality toward the ideality, it takes a good wisdom. That's what the life is about. But some people believe knowledge will bring you to ideality. That's not, I don't think that is true. Because knowledge without wisdom, you are not going to become so ideal. So what you do, what you study in school, if you focus so much on knowledge, you're not getting it. You're doing this education, you're paying all this tuition, and you're spending this hours and hours of time watching this video and doing the learning, not only to acquire knowledge, but to get wisdom. And if I, as a professor, fails to provide you with the wisdom and just provide you knowledge, then I'm not total failure, but I'm not a good teacher, a good professor. So the reason that we are doing all this dialogue between present and the past, learning the facts and interpreting, is to get the wisdom from the history. So again, I'm saying, what is history? And then why do we do the history? So we get that wisdom to live out the reality. Here's a John Jacob Anderson saying, history is a narration of events which happened among mankind, including an account of the rise and fall of a nation or nations, as well as of other great changes which have affected the political and social condition of the human generation, human race. So this Anderson, scholar, historian Anderson, he sees the macro history. So as we do the study, the scholastic study, any academic study, macro and micro provides a good paradigm for doing an academic study. So this is a macro definition of history, the whole thing, human generation, humankind. So the history deals with the whole human generation from the beginning toward the end, if there is an end. And he says, it's about the rise and fall and the changes. These are some of the key words as you do the study in history. The American church history, as you look at American church history, we are going to discuss two great awakenings. Two great awakenings. These awakenings are the spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening. It is a spiritual rise and the fall. In 21st century America today, the church is going down. The number and then the spirituality and its influence, everything, the missions, overseas missions, all the numbers indicate that it's going down. The young people no longer comes to the church. Only certain minimal, very little percentage of 20, 30, in their 20s, in their 30s come to church to worship regularly. See, this means the fall. So, rise and fall. And then changes. Changes does not really, it's not necessarily has to do with the fall and the rise. There are some changes in theology, changes in politics or polity of a church, change in the structure. That does not really mean rise or fall, but it is like a changes. So in American church history, you find these changes. Not only in the church history, if you look at your own life, if you are able to go back and review all your own life and see your rise and fall, it depends on your academic rise and fall. You could say also your financial rise and fall, or you could say your family rise and fall. I mean, there is many different categories to look at rise and fall. But if you look at those and say, if you can determine why these things happen and how am I going to change so I can bring the rise to my life, then you have that wisdom. That's the wisdom. And the changes, you have some changes that doesn't necessarily has to do with a rise or fall. But if you look at those changes, there is going to be some wisdom that you are going to learn from those experiences. So these are the art of doing the history. And Arnold Toynbee is this guy, historian and philosopher, says history not used to is nothing. For all intellectual life is action, like a practical life. And if you don't use the stuff well, it might as well be dead. It means the utility of history. You should use history, and you must use history. So history is there to use, and that's the reason that we do American church history. So let's kind of try to summarize what I have done. Yeah, I quoted this from, from Arcadia Publishing. That's the source of this material. Says, help us develop a better understanding of the world. The global history and the macro history tells you better understand the world. In our case, it helps us to better understand American church. Whether it's a white church or ethnic church, the American church, if you do the history, you are going to have better understanding of the church. Help us to understand ourselves, who we are, as a Christian. And even if you're not a believer, if you live in America, you cannot avoid dealing with Christianity, the heritage, and its influence. It is everywhere, even though you're not a Christian. So that, in that sense, it helps you to understand yourself better in America by doing American church history. You understand what kind of nation this is. Because the American church takes such a large part in formulating the America today as a nation. It is key and critical to have the understanding of American church and its history. So as long as you live in America, it is kind of mandatory to understand American church and its history. Number 3, it helps us learn to understand other people. If you're a Christian, it helps us to understand non-Christian Americans by doing the American church history. Okay, then it helps us learn to understand, it teaches a working understanding of change. Yeah, I discussed about the change. History means the change, whether you like it or not, whether you intended it or not, there is always that change. For example, the pandemic that we are experiencing, coronavirus, it had brought, dramatic and drastic changes to how we live. See, people think as human generation progress and evolve, we'll live in a better world than yesterday. But history tells you it's so far from the truth. The climate change, yeah, I mean, having the cars and driving and doing everything faster and easier that you think that will improve the quality of life for all human generation. But the matter of fact is many more are suffering because of this all technology and the automobile and then use of energy that comes from the fossil fuel, meaning the coal and then petroleum. See, so that's kind of very paradox of the human reality. You try to bring the better life to the human generation, the humankind, and the history tells you that that's not the case. As much as you try to bring a better life to the human generation, it also brings this disaster to human generation. So that's understanding of change. The similar things happen in American church history. The missionaries thought that they are doing the good for the Native American Indians. But many times these so-called missionaries were used by those with a political motive or financial motive. And then as they were contacting this Native American as in these missionaries, unintentionally they bring this virus and the bacteria that are very foreign and new to these Native Americans, and they don't have an immune system. Just like a coronavirus today, they kill many, sometimes millions, because this missionary came into their community and brought these germs, the disease. So you need to understand that these implications, the changes, how these changes occur. And the next time we'll be more careful. And with your good intentions, sometimes it may bring very negative result to the very people that you love. And the history, it gives us the tools we need to be decent citizens. Decent citizens. Or better citizens. So those who really learn a good and who does good history, again, gets that wisdom, not just the knowledge, but wisdom. And this wisdom will enlighten you and make you mature as a person, as a people. So when you become mature as a person, of course you become a better citizen. Better citizens not only think of themselves, himself or herself, but they care for the community and other people. They are concerned with the other people, and they think, how can I serve others? See, that's the key. And the doing history, as you do the American church history, you are going to learn and think, how can I serve American church so we become a better church? That's the whole idea of doing this history. Okay? So for us, it's not just a decent citizen, we want to become a decent or better Christian. So as we do the American church history, we want to become a better Christian ourselves. Meaning, you beginning to think about serving others as a mature Christian. Doing a history helps us to make better decisions. See, that's one of the key things for doing history, any kind of history. And for us, doing American church history, it helps us to make a better decision. If you're Chinese, I suggest that you do the Chinese church history. If you're Korean, do the Korean church history. That's going to help you to make a better decision as a Christian, as a believer. Making better decision, and also better communication. It's not there, but I'll add a better communication. So having to have a better decision and better communication will make you a more mature person. Because all the wisdom comes down to having to make a better decision for today than yesterday, and this time than the last time. See, that's how you become a mature person. If you're making the same decision, if you're making the same bad decision, you're dumb, you're foolish. But if you're just making the same decision, which is just, it's not good, but it's not bad, but it's not that good either, then you're not growing, you're not maturing. You're not making mistake, but making same decision over and over again in the same situation, not improving, you're dull. Not dumb, but you're dull. And in English you say you're stagnant. Stagnant means just stay the same. In Christian perspective, you are mandated, required to mature, become wiser every day. Because that's what God wants us to be, to mature and grow every day as time goes by. So you learn from the history and should learn to become a better person, a better Christian in all the areas of life. And then not only make a better decision, better communication. If the decision is for yourself, communication is for others. So if you're a good decision maker and good communicator, you are a leader. A better word for Christian would be you are a steward. Steward of God, steward of within the church. So every Christian needs to become a steward of God, steward of a church who serves by making a good decision and making a good communication. And then it says the history helps you to do that. So it's a good thing. Then, helps us, the history helps us develop a new level of appreciation for just about everything. The history is that important about everything. You're able to make appreciation to your life, the reality, your surroundings, your jobs, your education, your family, your church, the things that, by doing history, you're able to appreciate what had happened so far. And you're going to appreciate what's going to come. And we call that hope. So, doing history, looking back and evaluating and making implications on that, and learning the principles, life principles, to live the reality that is given, it brings a hope to the future. It doesn't say here, but I'm going to add, it helps us to have that hope. Hope eternal and hope in our future. See, so that's very important. And with all this significance, that's quite a reason and reasons to do the history. And if you're a Christian, doing American church history would benefit us, for sure. Now, as we do the history, here's one of the main questions or issues. When you ask the question, whose history? Actually, we are asking two different questions. Number one, whose history? So who has written or who is writing the history? Who is writing the American church history? Usually Anglo-Saxon, white, Protestant Christians. They are the ones who have written and wrote this American church history. The majority of the books that we read, unless it says the Black American church history or Afro-American church history, most of the books, the majority of books are written by those. Thus, it is limited. The perspective is limited. It's just kind of narrow, or slanted. Then the second part of the another question that relates to whose history is the subject of the narrative. Who are the main characters of this history event? And if it's written by the white Anglo-Saxon Christians, Protestants, then most likely they are going to write about those Anglo-Saxon, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? I told you it's W-A-S-P, WASP. WASP is those stinging bees. Bees are small, wasps are bigger. So, the whose story, whose history is that rich and famous? Usually it is. Usually it is about rich and famous. And usually the history is written by and about, powerful or oppressed. Have you read any history that's been written by poor and oppressed? I haven't, rarely we see those. We don't find any written material that is written by Native American people, Christian. There were Christians who were persecuted, oppressed, and even killed by same white Anglo-Saxon Christian Americans. They unknowingly have massacred and killed some of Native American Christian who's just been converted. So that's a sad part of history. And then because they didn't have their own writings, the Native Americans, they were not able to write anything from their point of view, from their perspective. Okay, let's take a break. Okay, let's continue the second part of week number 4. So, whose story? Who writes them, by whom, and for whom? Usually, the history that we read are from rich and powerful versus the poor. And then theirs or ours. The question here is, can you identify yourself with the written history that we read? So is it about one of us or one of them? If you cannot associate yourself with the history that you're reading, then it's called irrelevant. Why the relevant is connected, you can identify yourself with, because it's one of us or one of you. Irrelevant means it's someone else's. Unfortunately, many of the histories that we read are not so relevant. It's irrelevant. The story of the king and those officials, who cares? But whether it's in Europe or in Asia, the history has been written about those, the power, the king, and not much about the people, the general public. And as we read the American church history, we should try to focus and the balance about the general Christian, just members, the faithful ones who are not the leaders, not bishops. So bishops and pastors and the directors and those leaders, yeah, they are important. I'm not saying they are not important, but they are important. But you need to balance the reading about how the people, the general people lived, and they practiced their faith. And then we comes to that question: are you trying to rewrite the man's history or God's history? What's the difference? Of course, we are dealing with the history of mankind. And when we say American church, it's not the people. But as much as what people did is important, you're trying to see behind that how God has moved His people, how God is involved in each event, and how God is leading this story toward the direction. See, that is the more important for us Christians as we do the church history. That's same for your personal story. If you do your personal history, it's the same thing. You're trying to look into how, not only how you did something and how you perceive the things, but you're trying to see from the God's perspective and the acts of God in your life. Because the reality we are experiencing is not without God. Again, it is always with God. God has been working and walking, the both of them. Walking and working with us throughout the reality that we had expressed. That's how we perceive the history and your personal, whether it's personal, macro or micro. Micro is your personal. Macro is the surrounding, the church and the earth and humankind, human generation. So that's the very big key to doing history. So to summarize this, as we do the history, we are not ignoring rich and powerful, their story, and the human story. But at the same time, we are trying to do poor and depressed and oppressed and isolated, looking less important, and then also our story that is relevant, and then looking God who is behind all these things. That's how we do the history as we do the American church history. Now the question of, is that history science or art? The answer is, of course, both. Now this Numa Dennis said, history is and should be a science. History is not the accumulation of events of every kind which happened in the past. It is the science of human societies. So he is saying three different things. First, history is science, and history is not going to deal with everything that had happened. And then history is about human society. That's how this person perceives the this academy of history. And the key thing that we want to look at it here is that he perceived the history as science. Has to be very logical, systematic, based on the facts. So that's what the science is, right? And it's about the data, and it's educated guess. That's what the science is. And the same thing applies to history, he said. Yeah, I think I'm missing something here, but there's a perspective that's saying history is an art. Because history is always open-ended. And I told you that history is very subjective. It is very difficult to be objective, except the minimum facts, the place and the time and the people who did what. That's as much as that we can be objective. But other than that, any historical writing is open to interpretation, meaning it's open-ended. You can say, not only you can say, you say whatever you think is proper. That's what the history is. It's a narrative. Narrative is an art. So there is no such a thing as, objective narrative. That's not possible. Even choosing of the word for the narrative, that's very subjective. So in that regards, the history is an art. So the answer is both. Yes, it is science, at the same time it is an art. So you need to balance science and art as we do the history. As we do American church history, you're going to face some of the facts, but other than those, it's going to be all artistic, creative, being very subjective. Now, this is the key to the discussion about the history part. So we did the 3 chapters: American, chapter 1, chapter 2, church, defining, 3, understanding history. So the key to the understanding of history as an academic or a science or art, whatever, how you define it, the key is historical perspective. I told you that history is never objective but subjective. It's because of this. Everyone has their own perspective, and one's perspective, historical perspective, may not be exactly the same as someone else's. Especially when you are a historian, a scholar, an expert, or professionals doing the history, your opinion is not going to be same with someone else's. You may agree certain part of interpretation of someone else's history, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to agree everything about he or she writes or how he or she sees. So if we have 10 different historians, that means we have 10 different perspectives. So as you read the books on American church history, you are not going to be able to find the person who is going to write it exactly with the same perspective on all the subjects. They may agree to one or two or some part of the events historically, but they are not going to agree on everything. So each book that you read about American church history, there is no fundamental common textbook. So that's why when you're doing history, you gotta read as many as different authors as possible to have a good historical understanding, and then develop your own perspective. So it's all about your perspective other than the wisdom. So wisdom is number one thing as you do the history, and having to have that perspective is the second important thing in doing history. So as you read and do American history with me, you don't necessarily need to follow how I perceive the American church history. And that's not recommended. I urge you to develop your own historical perspective. If you could. If that's not such a a possible thing at the college level that we are on, then you need to develop to further. And then why perspectives? When you are living in a reality that you are put into, as a person, as a responsible human being, you cannot avoid to build and exercise your perspective. If you don't have a perspective, you're just like a machine, a robot. See, you're not a human being if you don't exercise your perspective. And perspective, that's who you are. Because your perspective is your identity. Which means, if you don't have perspective, you don't have identity. See, I just talked about last week about, we were educated in, especially in an Asian culture, Asian countries that we know of, and my generation list. We are educated in such a way that we are forced to have very similar perspective, or even one perspective, and you didn't have that freedom and then open ability or the possibility of having different perspective than what the government says You should believe in this. You should follow this. And we call that militant, or authoritarian. And see, that's very easy. I mean, it's much easier for those in power to rule your people. That's why it is pursued by the leaders. Whatever the ism that you're being brainwashed, the people share the same perspective, just as the ruler wants them to have. Then it's much easier. In the church, the thing is, in the church, some church leaders want their people, their members, to have the one unanimous perspective, just as the leader wants them to have. When that happens, it's no longer a healthy church. It's not a healthy church. Then many, the sect and the pseudo-Christianity, they do have this. So it is very key and important to develop your own perspective. And you are not only free to do that, and actually you are obligated to have your own perspective. That's how God designed us to be. Everyone to be different. While we share something that is common, but God had designed us to have something that's different, unique. So we can identify ourselves from one to another. This is called the distinction. God wants us to be distinguished with those distinctions, because every one of us is special. So that's how we believe. Because of that, you need to develop your own perspective. Then second, either you're going to have a very secular idea about history or a Christian idea of history. The major difference between the secular and Christian perspective in history is the Christian belief that every event and the changes that happen in human history, whether it's micro, personal, or macro, or global, God is there behind it. It is God who is monitoring and sometimes involving and sometimes initiating. So that's how Christians perceive the history. That perception, we need to be common. It's not something about the identity. Yeah, it is something about the identity. All the Christians need to share that perspective. But there are going to be some differences. Then we have church versus kingdom perspective. That's not the verses, but we need to have church perspective and the kingdom perspective. As we do the American church history, we are not looking at the church only. Some historians wrote their history looking at the church only, not the kingdom perspective. Kingdom perspective is much wider, it's much bigger, and it deals with some other issues rather than religious. Many church historians looked at the church history from religious perspective, and that's limited. I wouldn't say that's wrong, but it's limited. Better perspective would be kingdom perspective. When you have kingdom perspective, it includes church. It includes church. The kingdom is wider, bigger, and more broader than church perspective. And then when you read the history and do the history, there's a people side, people perspective on people, and perspective on events. We need to look at both of them and try to connect the events to the people and people to the events. What I mean is, as you read the history, you see this principle. Sometimes the events brings the change to the people. Again, events, what had happened, brings change to the people. On the other hand, sometimes people, through the events, they make the events to happen to bring the changes. So this works both ways. People bring the change, and the events, and events bring the change to the people. It's vice versa. So sometimes you need to look at trying to identify, is that the events that brings the change to the people, or is the people that brings the change through the events, or both sometimes. And this is a very important perspective in doing the history, any history. And especially when you read the Gospels, the story of Jesus, that's going to be one of the key paradigms, the issues. Then facts and interpretation. You should be able to distinguish the facts and the interpretation. The facts are pure facts. That does not have any interpretation involved. Usually the date and the place. But the funny thing is, sometimes history, they may not agree on the time and the place. And then when that happens, when that is the case, then even the time and the place is open to interpretation. When you don't have solid record, or sometimes may have different record to the same event. The time is different, place is different from A writer to B writer, even though they are the people at the given event and the time. Even the eyewitness, they may differ. Then it is open to interpretation. But usually, the time and place that happened are the facts. But how it happened, usually that's where the difference comes. When A author and B author writes the same events, they may differentiate in the writing of how it had happened. So that means that already it involves an interpretation. It does include interpretation. Okay, chapter 3, history, item number 7. Why do we do church history then? first thing, the reason that we do the church history, whether it's American church history or early church history or Chinese Korean church history, any church history you do is to find out about the divine plan. Divine plan means what is the intention of God? How God is working? Where are we going? Where God wants us to go. See, that is the divine plan. So every event and the people in American church history that we look at, then we're going to ask the question, what is God saying? What God is saying through this? And then we need to find that answer. Because the history is not going without deep plan. God has deep plan. And our purpose of doing the church history is try to understand the plan. It's a macro plan, the big, huge plan. And under deep plan, God has many plans, small plans. So these small plans come together to make the deep plan. So as we look at the event, one event in church history. For example, we talked about first there's a first and second awakening in American church history, and these are the key historical events. It's not just one event and several events, but as we look at the first awakening and then also second awakening, we are able to find the plan. The plan is that we are going to have maybe another awakening, the third wave of the Holy Spirit. And some say that's already happened. And some say no, it's not. So that's open to interpretation. But the thing is, we are trying to find the plan, the divine plan. So as we continue to study this American church history together, the major outcome, the finding, would be the plan of God. What is the intention? What is this? What is going to happen at the end, in the future? So we'll try to answer that together. Okay, I think time's up for this week today, and we'll continue the other subjects next week. But until then, please review what you heard and try to get some better understanding on the subject of American church history. And thank you again, and we'll see you next week. Bye.